because we're going to be looking at these ups and downs in his life and how he managed them. So let's listen.
So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One day Joseph went to visit his brothers as they tended their flocks. As he approached, they said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns." Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now, when Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Because Joseph was well built and handsome, after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, so she caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done. Because the Lord was with Joseph, he once again had success in whatever he did. The word of the Lord.
Would you have me in a word of prayer? Let's pray. Guys, we get ready to dig into your word. We have this amazing example of Joseph. Help us to learn from the example of this godly man. Just to learn what we need to learn for our lives so that we can take another step farther in faith, another step more in trusting you. Help us to hear what your word has to teach us right where we are, just as we are, at our current place in our faith journey. And help us to soak it in, to hear it, but then to let it sink into our hearts so it can begin to actually affect the way that we live and the way that we love, making us more and more the people you intended us to be. With that said, Lord, help me to get across your word. Use me as your mouthpiece. Help me be accurate, forceful, and humble. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Are any of you familiar with the author Stephen Ambrose? Stephen Ambrose is an author who writes a lot of military books. He's done a lot of those military books. I believe Band of Brothers is one of his. They made a movie out of it. But he also writes a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And for those of you that might not know much about it, Lewis and Clark expedition they were literally this large party commissioned by the U.S. government to go and explore the middle part of the country and to find, hopefully, a water passage from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Right? Because up until that time, not too many white men had ventured west of the Mississippi. Think about your geography. That's a lot of country, right, that hadn't been explored. A few trappers had made it into that part of the country, and of course the Native Americans were there, but not any kind of organized expedition. So go ahead and pull that slide up if you have it. In this book, he tells this story about this expedition. And how after 2 years of of battling almost insurmountable problems, right? Hunger, fatigue, hostile Native Americans, severe illness, even death. And one of the most, as you read this book, one of the hardest challenges they faced, grizzly bears. Up until that point, they hadn't run into grizzly bears before. If any of you have ever been in a zoo, they're fairly big, right? And at that point, they had no fear of human beings. So they were constantly having these encounters with grizzly bears. So they're facing all of this stuff, right? And they had reached the headwaters of the Missouri River. They had followed the rivers up until they had reached the headwaters of the Missouri River. And all their advanced information had led them to believe that once they reached the Continental Divide, which they thought the headwaters of the Missouri River were at, they would just face like a little half-a-day portage. They'd take their boats and they'd walk them across. And then they would reach the waters of the Columbia River and have this nice, safe water journey to the Pacific Ocean. Right? They were on their way to hero status. The hard part was behind them, or so they thought. How many of you are familiar with American geography? What is between the Missouri River and the Columbia River? A little half-day portage down a nice calm plain? No, this is what is between. Go ahead and put that up. As he rounded this bend, he saw this little geographic feature in the United States called the Rocky Mountains. Right? And I'm trying to imagine, first of all, what he must have felt. And then second of all, how he figured out he was going to go tell his guys. Right? Not quite what we expected, gentlemen. You see, we still have to go over those. Right? What do you do in your life when you think your biggest problems are behind you, only to come around the bend and to find another huge obstacle right in your way? Right? How do you rally yourself? How do you rally the rest of the troops? Right? Now, eventually crossing the Rocky Mountains would probably be the supreme achievement of their whole trip, which was filled with amazing achievements. As it would, this challenge would call forth amazing creativity, perseverance. When they got to the other side of the Rockies, they were as good as dead, and it was only through the kindness of some Native Americans that found them, that fed them, that sheltered them, that allowed them really to survive. But crossing the Rocky Mountains built tremendous confidence in this group, because they figured, man, once they got through those, they're like, whatever else we face, we got it, right? We can do this. But on this side of the Rockies, when they were looking at this view, they didn't know any of that yet. All that they knew was that when they were hoping for a downstream ride, just a little bit of peace and comfort and a little bit of an easy journey, they were going to face one of the most difficult obstacles they had yet to face. The reason I tell you this is because we heard part of a story, and we're going to be talking about a gentleman today, Joseph, who understood this idea all too well. An easy life, right? The favored son of his father in a large family. He's the youngest. How many of you are youngest children out there? Raise your hands. How many of you are spoiled like Joseph? Yeah, put them up. That's right. All right. We firstborns do all the hard work, right? We break the parents in so that you youngest ones get some smooth, or they're just exhausted. By the time you come along, they're like, man, this parenting thing's hard work. Do whatever you want. Curfew, whatever. I don't care. Go ahead. All right? And that was Joseph. He'd been born to Jacob in Jacob's old age. He doted on him. He spoiled him. He got the special robe. The other brothers didn't. He willingly admitted that he loved Joseph more than the other brothers. And understandably so, the other brothers resented Joseph. So Joseph has this nice, smooth life, but then the other brothers do something a little bit unbrotherly. They decide to kill Joseph. That's some serious brotherly angst going on there, right? But one of them talks him out of it, so instead of killing him, they sell him into slavery. Now, Joseph is a very intelligent, strong-working man whose God says God was with him. And he rises to the top of Potiphar, the Egyptian who buys in the household, but because he's good-looking and handsome, right? Some of you guys can relate to that. Potiphar's wife decides to go all cougar on him, right? And he resists. And he runs away, and she lies So he goes, once again, from being this privileged, now he's still a slave, but this privileged slave being thrown into prison. And again, you see this situation. He thinks he's come around the bend. He thinks maybe things are finally starting to settle down for him, and boom, there are the Rocky Mountains. Now, if you'd like to follow along, and I encourage you to, take out your sermon outline, because in the midst of these situations, we all have faced them. Sometimes the things that we face in our lives are very difficult, and the mountains are huge, and sometimes they're like the Appalachian Mountains. They're just kind of there. They're kind of tiny, right? I remember living back east, and my friends talking about these great mountains, and we went to the mountains, and we were there, and I kept asking, so where are the mountains, right? Where are the mountains? And we face things in our lives that challenge us, that cause us to lose control. But studies have shown that there are some certain qualities, and the story of Joseph brings these qualities out in spades, I think. Certain qualities that people have that not only allow them to get through those difficult situations, but to actually become better as they go through them. To not only just persevere, but to grow stronger and deeper and better than they were before they faced those difficult situations. And I want to talk about a few of those today. The first one is this, and Joseph does such a great job of showing us this. The first one is to stay true to your values. Studies have shown that people that remain true to their values in difficult times, even when they're tempted, come out stronger and better. I mean, perseverance produces character from Romans 5:4, it tells us. And you know the story of Joseph. Once again, it would have been so easy for him. She was the mistress of the house for him to give in and just say, okay, I'll sleep with you. But instead he ran away. Right? And look at this, Genesis 39:11 through 12. It says he's in the house, and Potiphar's wife caught him by the cloak, said, come to bed with me. He's a slave. Right? Probably hasn't been with a whole lot of women. Probably pretty tempting. I mean, this might even be a way to stick it to his master. Oh yeah? I'm your slave. Well, tell you what. Right? I'll sleep with your wife. Let's see how you like them apples. Right? But no. He has values. He stays true to his values. And he pays a consequence for it. She lies and he goes back, or he goes into prison. Right? Loyalty to your values and belief systems, even when it means suffering, is a powerful catalyst for character formation. Right? There's this misnomer out there that sin is easier when times are good. In all actuality, it's completely the opposite. Sin is so much more tempting when times are tough. Because we run into the arms of the person we shouldn't to. We run to the gambling machine. We run to the internet sites, right? We run into these behaviors because we're tired and we're worn and we're weary, and it's an escape. But studies have shown that those that remain true to their value system, that stay committed to a core belief system, come through difficult times stronger and better than they went in. I mean, Carl Jung has this great quote. He says, sin is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Sometimes we will suffer. That does not mean that we have to sin. Another value that is brought out, a characteristic, is folks that face difficult times and came through them better and stronger do not take the easy way out. And that's your second point. They do not take the easy way out. What if the Lewis and Clark expedition had seen those Rocky Mountains and said, okay, that's it. 2 years we've been doing this. That's too much. We've done a lot already. We're done. Let's go back, tell them what we found, tell them there is no way to the Pacific Ocean. They can send somebody else out. They didn't do that. And because they didn't do that, they are remembered as some of the most famous men in the history of our country. They did not take the easy way out. John Ortberg writes these words. He says, faith believes that with God, we are never helpless victims. No matter what, sometimes your hard times are caused by other people. Sometimes they are caused by your decisions. And sometimes they're just there. But you don't have to be a victim when you face those difficult times. Because in our country, doesn't it seem like a lot of people like to be victims sometimes? Woe, always me, I can't do anything about it. And so people take the easy way out. They don't stay true to their values. They don't go through the challenges. They try to find ways around them. But when you do that, your opportunity for growth, to become better, stronger, to learn something, is minimized when you take the easy way out. I mean, Joseph showed this attribute again and again. Sold into slavery, rises to a position of prominence, framed and put into prison, works his way into the graces of the guard, the main jail holder. Tells some of the prisoners that he's with some information about their dreams that allow them to come out of prison. They promise to tell the Pharaoh. They forget. And once again betrayed, left in prison. But again, rises out of that as he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Again and again, Joseph did not look for the easy way out. He could have rolled over. He could have just done the bare minimum as a slave. He could have just said, my God has left me. I can't believe I'm in this situation. I'm not even going to try anymore. But again and again, he rises above his circumstances. He gets through. And not only does he get through with authority and skill and ability. Right? It is always easier to quit than to keep trying. Right? It's hard to find a job. I'm just going to quit looking until things get a little bit better. Man, living on a budget is hard. I'm not going to be so disciplined in my spending. I'll use my credit cards as a temporary fix until times get a little bit better, right? Or I hear this one a lot, and people come in, marital problems, and barring some kind of infidelity or some kind of abuse going on, I encourage you to work your way through it, because marriage is hard. Shouldn't always be hard, but there are times when it is very hard. But if you work through it, you learn about yourself. You learn about your spouse. You actually become a better couple on the other side of the difficulties that you face. Right? Opportunity for growth if you do not take the easy way out. Another characteristic that Joseph illustrates and the studies have found, people that are able to come through difficult times without resentment, with strong perseverance, find purpose. Find purpose in your pain. That means see if there's a bigger meaning behind this. Kathy, if you would put up the entire Romans text, the one 2 through 5, not just 3 and 4. Let's look at the entire Romans text. For those of you that are following along, it's your scripture verse that's on the top of your outline. Look at this text. This is such a good text. Let's read this together. Right? And we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our suffering, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God has poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, who He has given us. Look at the first line of that. All right? We rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. But now look at the second sentence. Not only so, but we rejoice in our suffering. Actually, think about that for a second. Rejoicing in your suffering. What is up with that? That is just crazy talk, right? Who rejoices in suffering? What good can come out of suffering? Well, I am here to tell you that a lot of good can come out of suffering, because suffering can produce in our lives character, right? It can produce in our lives character and perseverance and hope. There is opportunity in difficult times to grow as a person, to grow deeper and stronger and better. Maybe Joseph needed the kind of experiences he had to become this amazing man. He eventually became second in the land of Egypt, only to the Pharaoh. Saved tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people from starvation when the famine hit the land. But as a spoiled youngest child, completely doted upon his whole life, maybe he would have never been able to achieve that. maybe he would have never been pushed and forced to draw deep from within himself and to lean heavily on his God. Maybe he would have never known what he was capable of. Right? In the midst of these storms, in the midst of going through these mountains, there is an opportunity to grow deeper, stronger, closer to God. Can you find purpose in your pain? Right? Julius Siegel, who was a psychologist who studied POWs in the Vietnam, POWs that have been released from Vietnam, writes this in one of his studies. He said, countless individuals beset by trauma report that their basic problem is an existence without meaning. When he would study these POWs, the ones that made it out, would tell him about the ones that didn't make it out. And maybe they would be going along fine for a while, but then all of a sudden they would lose their faith. They would lose compassion for their fellow inmates. They would just, in a sense, give up and not have a greater, deeper purpose and meaning to their lives anymore. And that was when they would begin to fade and die. Can you find the deeper purpose in the difficult times you face? You know, we've been trying to expand the school for 2 years. And we swear to goodness, every time we come around the bend, it looks like we've got some smooth sailing. There are another set of mountains in front of us. Miriam Dake, the preschool director, says, you know, Pastor, maybe God still needs to teach us some things in the midst of this. And I'm going to go with that. All right? We still need to learn. Maybe we need to improve our communication with our neighbors. Maybe we need to get better at working with the commissioners. Maybe we need to become more humble. There is purpose in the midst of the struggle. And then finally, maybe the most important one, that's why I saved it for last, people who face difficult times and come through better and stronger continue to trust in God. They might question, they might doubt, they might even get angry, but they don't stay in those places. They continue to trust that God is with them, even if God is obscured from their sight for a while. Again and again in the story of Joseph, right? Chapter 39 and chapter 41, the Lord was with Joseph. This is after he'd been sold into slavery. He succeeded in everything he did. And then he gets betrayed and thrown into prison. But it reminds us again, but the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him his faithful love. And then finally, after being in prison for a long time, he's brought out by the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says this about him. Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? In the midst of this all, Joseph leaned on his God, relied on his God, trusted on his God, and so he never faced the difficult time alone. It is so often in our suffering that we develop true compassion and begin to understand maybe that God is enough, because we just don't have the strength to do it on our own. Deuteronomy 3 says these amazing words. Would you please read it with me? It says, do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord will personally go ahead of you. He will be with you. God will not fail or abandon you. Believe that. Go home and memorize that verse. Take your outline, put it on your refrigerator, and memorize Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. Because maybe right now in your life, you're floating down the Columbia River and things are good. You know what? If that's the case, give thanks. Because eventually, and anybody who's lived for any length of time knows this, eventually what's going to happen? You're going to come around a bend, and the geographical feature of your life is going to change quite dramatically, right? What are you going to do when that happens? Are you going to give up? Are you going to complain? Are you going to go through it? Are you going to learn? Are you going to trust? Are you going to keep going? If you know that God is with you, you will be able to overcome whatever obstacles God places in your path. Will you join me in a word of prayer? Let's pray. Gracious Lord, help us to remember that no matter what happens in our lives, you are with us in the midst of it. Help us to remain true to our values, even when times are hard. Help us to have the strength of character to not take the easy way out, but to find the purpose in whatever might be happening in our lives, happening in the lives of those around us. And then, Lord, help us to grow deeper and stronger in the midst of it. Closer to you, closer to those that we love, those people around us.